Hi everyone, welcome back to RX Explained. I'm Emily Carter. If you've been following MS research, you know that 2025 has been a roller coaster for BTK inhibitors. We're comparing Fenebrutinib and Tolebrutinib, two drugs that both promise to revolutionize MS treatment, but their journeys couldn't be more different. So grab your coffee, hit that subscribe button if you haven't yet, and let's break down what just happened in the world of MS therapeutics. Let's talk about why everyone's so excited about BTK inhibitors. BTK stands for Bruton's tyrosine kinase. It's an enzyme that plays a crucial role in activating both B cells and microglia. Now here's why that's a game changer. Traditional MS drugs, like Ocrevus, work great at stopping B cells in your bloodstream from attacking myelin. But here's the problem. They can't cross the blood-brain barrier effectively. They're like security guards standing outside a building when the real trouble is happening inside. BTK inhibitors are different. They're oral medications that can actually cross into your brain and spinal cord. Think of them as having a VIP pass to the central nervous system. Inside the brain, they target microglia, the resident immune cells that drive that chronic smoldering inflammation we call progression. This is the inflammation that happens inside the brain, independent of relapses. It's what causes that slow accumulation of disability that's been so hard to treat. So essentially, BTK inhibitors promise a 2-for-1 deal, controlling peripheral inflammation and tackling the chronic damage inside the CNS. Now let's talk about these two drugs and what makes each one unique. First up is Fenebrutinib from Roche and Genentech. This is a non-covalent BTK inhibitor that you take twice daily. What makes Fenebrutinib interesting is how it's engineered. It's designed for high potency and selectivity, meaning it hits its target hard while leaving other pathways alone. Roche is currently testing it in phase 3 trials for both relapsing MS and primary progressive MS, which is pretty ambitious. Next, we have Tolebrutinib from Sanofi. Like Fenebrutinib, it crosses into the brain, but it has a slight convenience edge with once daily dosing instead of twice daily. Sanofi specifically designed this drug to tackle that smoldering neuroinflammation I mentioned earlier, that slow burn happening inside the brain. They were evaluating it for the harder-to-treat forms of non-relapsing secondary progressive MS and primary progressive MS. Now here's the thing, on paper, these drugs look pretty similar. They both inhibit BTK, they both target B cells and microglia, they both get into the brain where the action is. But when it came to their clinical trial results, that's where these two drugs went in completely different directions. November 2025 was huge for MS research. Let me break down what happened with each drug. On November 9th, Roche announced what they called unprecedented results. Fenebrutinib became the first BTK inhibitor to hit its targets in both relapsing MS and primary progressive MS. Let's look at the data. In the FENhance 2 trial for relapsing MS, Fenebrutinib significantly reduced annual relapse rates compared to teriflunomide. Now, this is massive because two other BTK inhibitors, Evobrutinib and Tolebrutinib, had both failed to beat teriflunomide in their relapsing MS trials. So Fenebrutinib succeeded where others couldn't. In the Fentrepid trial for primary progressive MS, the results were equally impressive. Fenebrutinib showed non-inferiority to Ocrevus, which is currently the gold standard treatment. Even more interesting, it started showing numerical benefits as early as 24 weeks. This matters because primary progressive MS is notoriously difficult to treat. We don't have many effective options for these patients, so Fenebrutinib literally made history as the first BTK inhibitor to succeed in relapsing MS trials. Now let's talk about what happened with Tolebrutinib, and unfortunately the news wasn't good. While Fenebrutinib was announcing positive results, Tolebrutinib faced two major setbacks in quick succession. First, on December 15th, the Perseus trial in primary progressive MS failed to meet its primary endpoint. This was significant enough that Sanofi immediately announced they're abandoning the PPMS indication entirely. Then, just 9 days later, on December 24th, the FDA issued a complete response letter. That's regulatory speak for application denied for non-relapsing secondary progressive MS. So why did the FDA reject it? According to the rejection letter, there were 3 major concerns. First, liver toxicity issues. There were cases of severe drug-induced liver injury. Some patients had liver enzyme elevations over 20 times the upper limit of normal. That's a serious safety signal. Second, unclear efficacy. The FDA found that Tolebrutinib's benefits seemed driven mainly by patients with active secondary progressive MS. But here's the problem. We already have approved therapies for that patient population. Third, the overall risk-benefit profile. The FDA essentially concluded that the liver risks were too high given the uncertain benefits for the intended patient population. This rejection was particularly significant because Tolebrutinib had been granted breakthrough therapy designation just 1 year earlier in December 2024, and it was even provisionally approved in the UAE. So this represents a major shift in the drug's trajectory. Let's talk about the safety profile, because this is critical to understanding why these 2 drugs had such different outcomes. With Tolebrutinib, the liver issues were concerning enough to derail the entire program. In clinical trials, 4.1% of patients had liver enzyme elevations over 3 times the upper limit of normal, compared to just 1.6% on placebo. But here's what really caught the FDA's attention. 0.5% of patients experienced alanine aminotransferase increases over 20 times normal. That's severe liver injury. Most of these events happened within the first 90 days of treatment, which meant patients needed frequent monitoring protocols right from the start. Now, Fenebrutinib isn't without liver concerns either. According to Roche, the liver safety profile was consistent with previous Fenebrutinib studies, and they haven't reported the kind of severe elevations we saw with Tolebrutinib. But we should note that Fenebrutinib did face a partial clinical hold from the FDA back in November 2024 after 2 patients showed possible treatment-related liver injury. So what's the key difference here? Fenebrutinib's liver issues appear to be more manageable and less severe, whereas Tolebrutinib's liver toxicity became significant enough that regulators decided the risks outweighed the benefits. That's ultimately what made the difference in their regulatory path. So, what does all this mean for people living with MS? Let's start with the promising news. Fenebrutinib is now positioned to potentially become the first approved BTK inhibitor for multiple sclerosis. If the second relapsing MS trial, called FENhance-1, succeeds when it reports in mid-2026, we could see regulatory submissions following shortly after. For patients, this could mean access to a high-efficacy oral treatment option, no more infusions needed. Even more importantly, it would be a single drug that works for both relapsing MS and primary progressive MS. That's significant because it targets both the peripheral inflammation that causes relapses and the central nervous system inflammation that drives progression. It's addressing the disease on multiple fronts simultaneously. Now, let's be realistic about what we don't know yet. We still need long-term safety data to understand how these drugs perform over years of use. There's also the practical consideration that Fenebrutinib requires twice-daily dosing, whereas Tolebrutinib was once daily. And despite the more favorable safety profile compared to Tolebrutinib, liver monitoring will likely still be a requirement for patients taking Fenebrutinib. As for Tolebrutinib, it's not completely off the table. Sanofi has stated they're committed to working with the FDA to find a path forward, and the drug is still under review in Europe. However, the bar is now considerably higher. They'll need to address those liver safety concerns and potentially identify a more specific patient population where the benefits clearly justify the risks. The BTK inhibitor race shows us that in drug development, being first doesn't always mean being best. Fenebrutinib succeeded where others failed, and that's going to change the treatment landscape for MS. If you found this helpful, smash that like button and subscribe for more drug comparisons. Thanks for watching RX Explained. See you next time.